Still clapping?
Yep.
Okay. How's it going, guys? Chalk Talk, episode 19, back again.
21.
Episode 21.
Wow, we're that far. My bad, episode 21. And we're here. We got two special guests, luckily, this week. We've got Dr. Quinn Henoch and we've got John Flagg. They're here for ClinicalAthlete, doing a seminar with us for powerlifting. And we're going to kind of get into detail a little bit more and give you guys a little bit of recap. As always, here with Rob and Edward. And here we go.
So thank you, Quinn and John, for coming out, hosting this certification course. We are halfway through day 2 at the moment, and we have learned quite a bit in terms of how to apply the principles of rehab in the context of powerlifting, in the context of the squat, bench press, and deadlift. And one of the first things you said, John, was that we want to treat this course as introducing a framework, introducing a way of understanding how to implement the principles of rehab in the context of sport versus, it's like, my elbow hurts or my bicep hurts when I do low bar squats. Here is a quick fix, a 6-week program you can follow. Do it. And over the course of the last day, you outlined very clearly what are the big things we are looking at so that we can meaningfully guide that process versus just sort of being at the mercy of social media, PT gurus, and the instant gratification, quick fix culture that we have become accustomed to. So could you give us as brief of a recap as you can of, like, what are the big picture ideas we're looking for in looking at rehab for powerlifting?
Well, I think it goes beyond just rehab. It also goes into the performance of powerlifting and looking at that as a spectrum. When I try to conceptualize this for the course, the big thing I'm trying to look at is not a system-guided approach. Like, I'm not sending people away with, like, okay, these are the steps that you take. It's more of a, how do we look at this critically and take into account of all the different variables that are going into it. So we talked a little bit about dynamic system theory. We talked a little bit about motor learning and the actual motor skill acquisition and what kind of time that takes and how many reps that takes and this whole thing being a process. So I want people to be exposed to that process and be able to critically think better and appraise better, so we do get away from, like you mentioned, gurus and the 6-week fixes and that sort of thing, to not just build more effective coaches, but also more effective athletes that can look at this process and have a better understanding of the foundations that guide these things and guide real change, as opposed to what we were talking about before with a quick fix. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that makes sense.
Make total sense. So, defining a couple of terms, how would you define system?
How would I define a system?
Yeah.
In my mind, a system, in the way people look at it from a rehab perspective or a coaching perspective, is here is inputs. You dump athlete into input, or you dump athlete into this particular system, and then you get X result, mm-hmm. right? So people look at it almost as if they come to a course and they figure out, this little process that's supposed to be magic, and that's not really the case, because this stuff is not as predictable as we'd like it to be. There are some things we obviously have to have a plan, but that plan has to be flexible, and I'm trying to teach people to be flexible within that plan to course correct, because I feel as coaches and as clinicians, we have to be a little bit more flexible with this stuff to allow that course correction to happen and not be so rigid.
One of the things that was refreshing to hear, but almost frustrating to hear, was how less of cueing you recommend. Where, like, as coaches, especially as younger coaches, it's like we want to demonstrate our knowledge, therefore we want to say more to let our athlete know, like, you have a problem, I have a solution, and it's going to happen right now, versus you let them self-organize into a solution, and you get them comfortable with this almost frustrating like process that requires more patience than we generally assume like happens in the learning process for powerlifting, as an example. So could you also define self-organize, or the process of self-organization for our listeners?
I can. When it comes to self-organizing in this particular context, what I look at is if the question we've asked all weekend is, can I stack performance on top of this, right? Is what I'm seeing in front of me something that's viable for performance in the long run? Now that's obviously a subjective question, right? And that's coach to coach to coach will say this does or does not work. But instead of throwing a large word vomit of cues out there that may be relatively non-specific, what I try to do is pick or select a particular constraint or pick a particular movement that's going to push them in the direction I want them to go and challenge them in that way. Now, that's not saying I don't use any cues. We just keep it limited and let the movement actually teach them a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And what you find is, is there a little bit of frustration because it's a new movement? Yes. But at least in my experience, and this is completely anecdotal, and we've seen it today, is people go, it's actually a little bit releasing as a coach. Instead of being like, okay, do this, 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 and this, but it doesn't pan out. And then the athlete gets frustrated, but then the coach also gets frustrated. Instead, it's like, okay, let's try this movement, and I want you to think about doing this. And you see them figure it out from rep to rep to rep. And we're trying to obviously keep them safe. I'm not saying, okay, now take that max with it. But allow that athlete to self-organize and go through some of that error process and start to figure it out. And then the coach can sit back and go, oh, wow, that looks great. And now it's a positive experience. And we talk about the same thing in rehab all the time. Like, how can we make our patients more self-efficacious? How can we build that self-efficacy? The same thing here with athletes. How can we do that with them? Yeah. You give them some of that power.
I think that was one of the biggest learning curves from yesterday and today for me, is that we had to talk about that and like letting them fix it themselves and solve the problem. I was like, it's like crazy to hear someone say that, because we're like taught, like, oh, fix this, cue this, cue this, cue this. Okay, do this right now. And it's kind of like you see a new bencher and it's all over the place. And then after a few sets of 10, it starts to kind of clean up and it's not so shaky. And so it's like, that's them figuring it out.
Yeah.
But like actively telling yourself to cue less was like such a mind-blowing thing for me today.
It is.
And trying to understand. And you're right. It's like, it's almost less on the coach as well. Like, okay, kind of let them go through this motion a few times and see if they can solve the problem. And then when you said, then they have that problem-solving skill as they move on in their lifting career. And if they come back to a problem, they have that like solution already, instead of us just like telling them and then they forget a day or two later.
Yeah, and it makes the athlete a lot less reliant on the actual coach, and allows the coach to actually course correct. So as a coach, it gives you more freedom, and you can actually sit back a little bit and let these things emerge. And then when there does have to be a course correction, that's when you can step in. And that, I honestly think, that shows more knowledge and shows more control of the actual environment than trying to micromanage that stuff, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I thought that part was awesome, and kind of letting them figure it out, and it's like more of a positive experience, because it's like when they figure it out, they become very happy. Like, oh, I figured it out. I understand how this moves now. This feels right, and then it's like it's such a rewarding thing for them as well as us. So that was definitely super cool.
Well, I'm sure we've all gone through sessions where we have an athlete, we just keep saying no, that's not right. No, that's not right. No, that's not right. Yeah. How great would it be to just change the movement fundamentally, or give them a variation and say, yeah, that looked a lot better. Do it again. Yeah, that looked a lot better. Do it again. It may not be perfect, but it's in the right direction. It's trending the way we want it to trend.
That's awesome.
And that can build a lot of positive momentum moving forward and stack up wins. We're trying to stack up wins as much as we can in training.
And I think an example of the opposite end of that spectrum is when someone comes into the gym and they're just warming up. They're starting their warm up and they're starting their squats with the empty bar, and they need to do about 3 to 5 sets before their technique feels comfortable. Like we would see the initial like first 3 sets and just start cueing versus like we all have noticed this where as they do more sets, they tend to find their foot position, the bar path, the control, the stability, all these things that allow the lift to meet the performance standard. Like that just happens over time, and we all experience that. And the like one of the most practical, tangible ways I noticed yesterday for the coaches was to observe that was to go through the quote unquote assessment process at the start before we even coach them, where in the context of 90-90 breathing, just let them lay down and take a couple breaths and just let them do their thing. Or when they put the empty bar on their back for some squats, just let them walk it out, unrack, and see how they set up, and let them do that for about 5 minutes on their own before you have a more big picture idea of how they respond over time as they warm up, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And I think that like for the listeners and for any coaches who are listening, like that could be an exercise they do where when the athlete comes in, like your mouth is zipped closed for the first 5 minutes that the athlete is moving, and just using that as an opportunity to build an understanding of how their movement evolves over time over the course of a training session.
Yeah, and one of the things we talk about it quite a bit clinically is active listening is a great skill, right? We get people that come in with chronic pain that really sometimes they just want to be listened to. Well, observation is listening to me in that piece, right? So if you come in and you have a new client that wants to squat or wants to learn how to squat, and they've got a little bit of experience, and you immediately just start jumping in and like taking over, what are you doing? That's like me asking a question and then answering it for somebody. So instead, how about we just let that kind of self-organize, see what's going on, take in what we're actually seeing, and let that self-organization happen in front of us real quick, and then we can say, okay, hey, look, I saw this. Let's try this a little bit, and allow that process to kind of happen.
And that is quite the shift in thinking for a lot of coaches, where it's like the coach wants to be the person who guides that process. I mean, the coach still has a part in it, but it's more of a companionship where the coach, like as you said, course corrects and allows the athlete to have these strategies emerge through the athlete over time, or through the patient over time. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really powerful shift in paradigm.
And to kind of piggyback off this, if we can, I was going to say my question until later, but it kind of goes with what we're talking about. This is for both of you. I don't know if you'll approach this the same way. I've been kind of trying to figure out how to ask this the right way without being super repetitive. But when you have an athlete who's successful training 5, 6, maybe 7 days a week, and they have an injury regardless of the injury, and they're kind of diminished to almost ground zero or very low on the spectrum, what are the first points or steps mentally and physically he would take with that client? And I know specificity plays a role in it, and athlete plays a role, but like you were saying, kind of sometimes aren't a coach, you're gonna just have to listen, or you're almost like a therapist in a way with that person. What would kind of be some main points just for athletes to kind of get out of their head when they do have something big happen and they've never had it happen? Or
you mind if I take this first? So obviously this is context dependent. It depends on the severity of injury you're talking about, but especially with athletes, I should take that back. With people in general, if they get injured, they're typically removed from a task or something that they like to do. I know for me, if I were to get hurt and miss time lifting, then I would probably be very frustrated just based off of that itself. So one of the things we have to do is kind of decatastrophize that situation a little bit. The first thing people think is they kind of drop a nuke on their life and think, I'm never going to lift again, this is going to be terrible.
Absolutely.
And instead, we want to kind of bring that down, and there are some things you're not going to be able to normalize, right? But we want to do the best we can to normalize this stuff. We understand there's risk with training. We understand that these things sometimes happen, and we just have to work through them, that it is a normal part of the process, and start to bring that kind of response down. And then gradually try to fold them back into whatever's comfortable and trying to get them back to that task. Now, like you said, if it brings them down to ground zero, we did a case study at the end of yesterday where a guy was at ground zero. And you decrease that threat level, you just kind of get him moving again. We don't want him to get deconditioned. So you just start to introduce movement as you have those conversations about this isn't the end of the world. And understand, you're going to have good days, you're going to have bad days. There's going to be ups, there's going to be downs. Just like with actual training, because we don't always have great training blocks. So that's where I normally start with it. And then you just build back in and fold back in, and then also get them to understand this process is probably going to take a lot longer than you would like it to. And if we can get those expectations set and get that catastrophe type of response down, then we can try to start working in a positive direction. Would you agree with that, Quinn?
Yeah, I think that I don't have a whole lot to add to that. I think reframing in the beginning is important. So I'm not a psychologist, and I don't need my athlete to, be frolicking in the field with butterflies and flowers and just be happy as can be when they're injured. It's like John said, it sucks, but realistic expectations right from the jump are important. And first of all, performance and health are inversely related. So if we're pushing our thresholds and performance boundaries, we are introducing risk inherently. And sometimes I think we forget about that and we try to train super, super hard, and then we're surprised if something goes awry. Where if you could just ask a simple question like, ask any of your buddies who train really, really hard if they've ever had an injury. And pretty much 100 out of 100 are going to raise their hand and say, yeah, I've had something go on. So right off the bat, we can say it happens. Now, the other piece of this is there's some ego that goes into it, because many times when an athlete can't train the way that they want to train, then it's like, well, I might as well not do anything, or I'm just going to take time completely off, or something like that. Whereas where we can come in and reframe that is, luckily you're an adaptive human and you have healing capacity. So time by itself is going to help this. What we can do is make sure that we mitigate deconditioning and train what we can train, because a lot of times you can actually make progress in other areas and not get in the way of Mother Nature, but we can still mitigate deconditioning or fitness loss and those types of things by training what we can train. John spent a day and a half talking about variation and different ways to take an exercise and keep somebody being able to do a movement and continue to load their body without inciting the exact issue that we're trying to make go away. So right off the bat, we can say like that's going to be the thing here. Let Mother Nature do her thing. We're going to find ways to keep you training, and that by itself is a paradigm shift for a lot of athletes. And I think just in general, without we're talking hypotheticals here, that's how I approach almost every case. It's just to make sure they're in the right headspace to start that process. And it's we talk it's not necessarily the most fun, but this is just kind of the way it is. It's a drop in the bucket. And I find that I just have to repeat that point. So there's no magic in that message. They understand. The magic is sticking with it consistently over time. And then when and if they have a little setback during the process, you reiterating those same points like you said it the first time, and not being impatient, because they're going to be frustrated. As a coach or clinician, if we get frustrated with them for being frustrated, you kind of lose that alliance. So I'm just reiterating the same simple points over and over.
Just keeping them kind of in check constantly.
Exactly. And say, okay, it's easy to zoom in on the day-to-day. We talked about how there's going to be up and down fluctuations. And I say, well, you see that in training all the time.
Yeah.
Are you your best in training every single day, regardless of if you're hurt? And I'll say, of course not. I have my good days and bad days. Rehab's the same way. We just happen to have the inconvenience of the pain experience confounding things a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's the same type of concept. So if we zoom out, we can say, where were you 2 weeks ago? You're doing this variation now. You weren't able to do that 2 weeks ago. Or you're doing this amount of load. So now it takes you this level of volume to flare up your symptoms, whereas before we were doing like half of that and you couldn't tolerate. So there are always these things that we can just keep them in the broad picture. So that's big picture. That's kind of how I try to frame things.
Yeah, I mean, in that answer, I think for a lot of young lifters and just young coaches in general, I think that's very, very helpful. It makes it very simplistic.
And back to the cueing conversation, if we can even simplify that a little bit and say, what is a cue? Is a way to shift attentional focus, and it's a way to manipulate the coupling of perception and action. So perception, action, perception. Those things feed into each other. The athlete's going to perceive and then act, but they're also going to act on what they perceive. So a cue is manipulating that little subsystem. We tend to just assume when we hear the word cue, oh, that's a verbal cue. A verbal cue is just one type of cue. There's tactile cues, there's demonstration, there's variation. So when we're having this great conversation, it's like, well, I'm trying to just decrease my verbal cue vomit on this athlete, and I'd rather than just do a movement or a variation and have that self-organized. That is a cue. You're just using the variation to cue the perception action coupling, but you're still cueing. It's just another way to go about it. So you've got different ways to go about this as a coach. Like you guys use the term course correction. I really like that. It's just a little nudge in the right direction. When against your judgment as a coach clinician, if you feel like the path is diverging to a point where I want to intervene a little bit, you've got options. And if one type of attentional focus, i.e. cue, doesn't seem to right the ship, you can try another tactic. And so you just keep that in mind, is what are we actually trying to do here? And I think that helps create a framework.
So before we give the whole course away through this podcast, Rob, Zach, do you have any more questions?
No, I'm good right there.
That's it for me, yeah.
Anything else?
No, I think that sums everything up so far in a very concise, meaningful way. John, Quinn, do you have any concluding thoughts, concluding remarks about the course so far? How do you like Jog It Up?
I love the
Gym
gym.
is awesome.
Almost at the same time. I liked it when I walked in the door. It's got space. It's organized well. It's got everything you'd want. Yeah, I love it.
I've talked to Rob about this, but I was here about a year and a half ago. Is when I first met Rob and saw the gym, and it's grown, and there's no surprise. You do it the right way, and I'm happy to see the success here. So it's really, really great. We'd love to be back and just keep on keeping on. And I did have one more remark on the systems thing. It was just in my head.
Yes.
I just want to say that. As we've talked about concepts like dynamical systems, so we're not anti-system because we talk about that. But what's dynamical systems? It's an organization of interacting parts. So if we can define system that way. Now, a rigid system is maybe the problem. That's maybe what we're trying to shy away from. So we define these interacting parts, and there's just one way to organize them, and there's one way to go about it. Where I think what we're advocating is we acknowledge these interacting parts, the individual, the task itself, environmental constraints, these types of things. These are the subsystems within the system. These are the interacting components of the system. And then we hopefully give you guys ways to manipulate those components to get some type of outcome. But we understand that those interacting parts, there's some chaos there, and I think that's the difference. We're flexible in our thinking of systems, but we understand that a system as a standalone is just an organization of interacting parts.
So it's like dynamic systems is a system that engulfs the answer, it depends.
Yeah.
That reinforces the idea that every output depends on the context, and we should be thinking about context more than we currently are.
Yeah, totally. I agree.
Yeah, that statement at the end, yes. I think there's a lot. I look at it from just inputs. I think there's a lot more inputs that people don't recognize, and stuff that we still don't even even recognize. There's a lot out there, and there's some inputs that we think we recognize that we don't fully understand yet, like fatigue, that make things a little confounding. So, yeah.
And I think it takes pressure off the coach as well, because so right off the bat you're like, well, there's going to be uncertainty in all of this, so I can kind of accept that. And then if the solution or the outcome is not exactly the way that we want, instead of being like, well, I did something wrong as a coach or athlete did something wrong, you could say, no, this is just the way that the subsystems interacted. This is just what happened. This was the outcome, period. So we can go back and see how we took those components. This was the interaction, this was the outcome, but we can change something now. So it becomes this tinkering process. And I think that takes a lot of pressure off of us as coaches. We don't necessarily take the blame or get the credit. It's just kind of this, yeah.
It's all an experiment.
Totally.
Well, to give everyone time to eat all their loaded fries, let's wrap things up.
Let's wrap things up. Thank you again, Quinn and John, for coming out. If you guys haven't heard of Clinical Athlete before, look it up. They're doing some really great things. For all of us here at Chalk It Up, Rob, Edward, Zach, we're out.
See you guys next time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.